the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest, we just want to mention we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there, or if not, leave us a review on iTunes. But today we're pleased to speak with Bradley McClean, professor of New Testament language and literature at Knox College, University of Toronto. He's the author of New Testament Greek, An Introduction, Biblical Interpretation and Philosophical Hermeneutics, The Cursed Christ, Mediterranean Expulsion Rituals, and Pauline Soteriology. And today's topic of discussion, published in 2022, Deleuze, Guattari, and the Machine in Early Christianity, subtitled Schizoanalysis, Effect, and Multiplicity. But Bradley, we're super excited to speak with you. When I saw this online, it really grabbed my attention, so we're super excited. I think this is the most excited I've been for a discussion in quite a while, which says a lot because we've spoken to some really amazing people over the last few months. We're really looking forward to digging into this and having a really fruitful and bountiful discussion. So welcome.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
And I hope you saw that, Bradley, that our followers gave a pretty hearty appreciation when I brought up. I had already asked you to come on the show, and I don't know why I was being cheeky, but I was like, "Hey, should we get this? Should we get this author on?" Everyone's like, "Yes, please. I want to see this," because you've brought to my attention that there are others writing in this vein, and you show that in the introduction. But it's not something that I think Coop and I were aware of. It's not something that I've necessarily delved into myself. So I do think it's very nice to be able to.
So mine was the first D&G book on biblical literature. The theology has had a long history of dealing with Deleuze. Biblical studies is very much its own thing. They don't talk to theologians. I'm sure you know that. And so as just by luck, mine was the first one to deal with Deleuze and early Christianity or early Christian literature.
See, now that's a good distinction to make because you're right. I think of someone like Philip Goodchild, who it has written on Deleuze and theology and others that you've mentioned. But that's a good distinction. Now, it is interesting, though, that even if you say you're in different camps, you do kind of make a general call to theologians or the discipline of theology to perhaps change how it might approach these things. Is that correct?
I guess I'm thinking more, seems to be a big difference between sort of denominationally rooted theology, which is what I often encounter, and a much broader open field of theology, which is already conversant with Deleuze and Whitehead and process theology and all of that. I do want to sort of invite theologians into a discussion and a practice which doesn't de facto treat Christianity as the ultimate form of religion and truth.
That's a good point you make, because there is a way, and I think I forget exactly how you make the distinction, but there's a way of treating it as an ontological absolute. And that may be how traditional classical theology might treat it, and as though, seated in truth, a regime of truth, so to speak, because you're talking about Christianity. I suppose when you're doing the kind of stuff that you've done since your first book, which I mentioned to you that I was reading, The Cursed Christ, that's really kind of hardcore biblical studies that brings along history, it brings along linguistics and philology and these other things. And so before we get deeper into these issues, and we can come back to this interesting distinction you're making between biblical studies and theology, I do want to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about your origin story, as we like to call it, your how you sort of got into academia or how you got into biblical studies, biblical literature, and then maybe where Deleuze fits in along the way so that we can see that line of flight leading up to this book.
Oh, well, thanks. It's a great question. When I came to Knox College, I was given the responsibility of teaching what you would probably call a course in exegesis. And prior to that, I was pretty much hard-baked in terms of a more historicist approach to early Christian writings. So then I started reading broadly, and one thing led to another. Heidegger led to Foucault, led to Althusser, Louis Althusser led to Gianni Vattimo, to Deleuze and the rhizome. And so in my first book everything really was connected. So my first book on hermeneutics ended with the rhizome.
Yeah, it ended with Deleuze and Guattari. Yeah, right.
Chapter 12, like the 12 apostles.
Okay.
So so that was my sort of first, maybe more formal way to say, well, what is this about? That's a long time ago now.
It was like 10 years, right? It was 2011-ish?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's right. But of course, I live in a place where a lot of people are aware that we are living in what they call a post-Christendom age. Sometimes they call it a post-Christian age, but in my world, it's post-Christendom. I think this is a time of opportunity for us. It's also, you could say it's a post-human age as well, when I would say the history of ideas has failed us, when traditional Christianity has failed us. And I think it's a time when the subject-object metaphysics is dead. And so I'm using the word post-Christian in a way that disavows the Christendom's myth of a pure origin with its traditional marks, and suggesting that as scholars, we now occupy deterritorialized, de-stratified space, if I can use Deleuze's words, in which we can ask new kinds of questions. And so Deleuzean theory actually invites us to deterritorialize the striated space of canons and creeds and doctrines, and to destratify all quasi-transcendentals. I'm aware that Gianni Vattimo once said that the meaning of our present age is the death of the subject-object metaphysics. And as authors such as Elizabeth Groats, who you had on your show recently, who recently wrote The Incorporeal, and Karen Barad and Jane Bennett, have all brilliantly explained, the metaphysics of subjecthood is dead. And therefore, the metaphysics of Christendom is dead.
This is interesting because I was trying to think, and I guess I'm circling back to what I mentioned as your first book, which I think has a great title. It almost sounds like a metal band, The Cursed Christ. I love the title, but it does feel like already you are exploring these questions or calling into question the very mode of questioning concerning origins of Christianity, which I think fully takes on its own life in this book, which again, we're going to get to in a second. Do you see the line I'm drawing between your first book and this book here on Deleuze and Guattari and machines and early Christianity, that you haven't yet gotten, or you found maybe new ways of discussing this question about the origins of Christianity?
I would say that book, and indeed most books dealing with early Christian literature, are still trapped in a very Kantian world where you've got terminology, concepts that map onto reality directly. Well, I shouldn't say that. Terminology, and you've got a mind which has faculties which are synthesizing it. And Kant would say that all we can know are phenomena that have been constructed by our minds. We never can know, be in contact with direct reality. And so that's kind of a point of bifurcation, because what Deleuze is saying is that we can escape the Kantian dilemma, and we can talk about how he says that. He's also saying, and this is maybe even more radical, that we can escape the symbolic world of Jacques Lacan, that there is a way out. There's a way out. And this is, maybe we'll talk a bit about the Matrix, because in a way, if we think of the way Morpheus offered Neo a choice between the blue pill and the red pill, a choice between the continued existence in a simulated world and the real, Deleuze effectively gives us a choice to live life as an organism, a life overcoded by capitalism to serve the needs of production, or life as a body without organs that's plugged into the intensities of the cosmos, a life plugged into the real, a life in contact with cosmic desire. And so Deleuze comes along and says, here's a red pill. And many of us call it rhizomatics or stratoanalysis or schizoanalysis or nomadology, but this red pill has the potential to throw our life world into motion. And then we open our eyes for the first time and we discover that our tragically predictable cosmos is really a chaosmos brimming with potentialities. And so there is this moment of decision for us, which we can talk about. And it's not a moment, not a leap of faith, because Deleuze is all about empiricism, but it's still a pivotal moment.
I think that's a great way of putting it. And I suppose that's what I was getting at, where it seems like you're trying to suggest to those still doing some sort of classical type of theology that Deleuze can offer some helpful tools. Because the way the book is constructed is not only in this broad frame of early Christianity, but also trying to deploy and show a handful of these concepts and then put them in dialogue with some of the work that you do as in terms of early Christian literature, with the first 3 centuries or so, I suppose it's the cutoff date that you set, right? I found that really interesting. And I guess that I suppose I was trying to think about how, one of the things that came to mind when reading this book was, and you mentioned it in brief, and so I won't belabor the point and we can move on after this. I'm supposing that do you feel like this move from a hermeneutic centric discipline to something that maybe doesn't contradict or deny hermeneutics, but forgoes the question of what does XYZ mean to sort of how it functions? I feel like that was one of the interesting ways in your conclusions to each chapter. You were able to mobilize that as one of the things where it's like, it's no longer a question about asking what is said as though information and communication were some sort of objective criterion, but what is functioning and how. And so I guess I almost feel like instead of it being moving to the other side of the mirror, as I was kind of saying before we started, it seems like a natural extension from what you were already doing in your work, because in many ways, the stuff that I'm reading in The Cursed Christ, you wouldn't necessarily say that to let's say a fundamentalist Christian. The things that you were calling into question, for example, the way that Luke goes about constructing acts in order to create a kind of epic narrative for the birth of the church. Those kind of questions, I think, for lay Christians, I don't even know if that's an oxymoron. You get what I'm saying? Everyday sort of, I'm from the South, so I'm just thinking about what my grandmother might think about that stuff. Although my mom and dad were deep into this interesting historicization of the Bible. So I'm just kind of thinking that is rhizomatics, or is, let's just say, just starting with I think that's one of the first concepts you begin with, is treating what you call Christ machines, right? The births, if you will, of the flourishings of these various strands of Christianity as a rhizome. Is that not a natural extension for maybe the kind of things you were being trained to do as from your work on your dissertation and on The Cursed Christ? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it certainly does. And so traditional New Testament studies or with some Christian origins or whatever, however you style it, depends upon the grounded subject. And on the basis of evidence, says that this is true, or at least it's a true perspective. And then scholars can argue about whether that is true or not in historical terms or literary terms or what have you. Deleuze takes very seriously that in the post-Kantian world, there is no grounded subject. In fact, there are no fixed points whatsoever. And maybe the most important transcendental in his work is temporality, time. And so everything is in flux. I'm in flux. I'm not a unified not a unified subject. Our world is in flux, and the meaning of texts, what Deleuze terms as sense, is in flux. And terminology does not map in any easy or straightforward way onto things of the world. So trying to create better versions of truth from this point of view is a fool's errand, because the truth of the cosmos is flux. And the rhizome, which is a virtual idea that everything is connected by intensities. We are a multiplicity overlapping with other multiplicities. So Deleuze is not interested so much in, well, he's not interested in whether this is the best term for this or that. He is interested in not just mapping change and transformation of systems, but in causing it. He wants to set things into motion. And he talks in Difference in Repetition about, I think, 5 heroes of repetition, 2 of which are in the Hebrew Bible. Job and Abraham are heroes, are Deleuzian heroes of repetition, set alongside Dionysus and Zarathustra, and strangely enough, Joan of Arc. And so the question Deleuze has is, does this concept work? And does it set things into motion? And so there's something profoundly ethical about Deleuzian philosophy. That's why I was referring to the red pill. The red pill, there's no point in taking it if you just wake up with a heightened sense of the real, because the real is in flux. And if it doesn't send things into flux, if it doesn't turn cosmos into chaos, then the red pill's a failure.
And I suppose that in that sense, I mean, I mentioned the rhizome, but I suppose we could go straight from the title, and you begin kind of provocatively, I think, in wanting to talk about, instead of the Church of Christ, or whether it be what ecclesias could be, or what an assembly of persons, you talk about machines. This seems like, in the title, it does feel like a bold choice to put that straight forward. That might perplex whether it be just, again, lay readers or readers from in your circles. I am curious about the decision about putting first and foremost this notion of the machine in early Christianity, and in this translation of, instead of thinking about the bodies or churches of Christ, we're thinking about Christ machines. And that was really provocative to me. And I think that straight off the bat gets you going full speed. Do you have an inkling of an idea for like where that came to you, or was this part of your experimentation?
Well, machines, of course, figure very prominently in 1,000 Plateaus, and that represents Félix Guattari's contribution, which just adapts those languages from, say, the logic of sense, for example. So it's really looking. One of the things one might say if one looks at Christian communities in North America is, in some ways, they seem to be kind of cut off from the world around them. What Deleuze says is at a virtual level, not at the level of bodies interacting with bodies, but at the virtual level, basically everything is connected to everything else through dynamic flows. And through those flows, things sometimes become more structured, and other flows of intensity can create things that are less structured. And so you could quite easily look at different Christ groups or communities of faith, whatever term one uses, and say, what kinds of machines are connecting this body, to other bodies? Are they rigid lines? Are they lines of flight?
Are they despotic? Are they passional?
Right? Yes, all that. I don't know how much you want to actually talk about real examples of. So maybe I won't digress.
We love to digress on the show.
Absolutely, please do.
Please.
That's where the interesting stuff happens on the margins, right?
Yeah, okay. So a friend of mine was talking about a church he was involved in that had declining membership, and they had this idea that they would open up a vegetable garden plot in the backyard and invite the community to come and say, here, you can have a plot here and here and here. And this would create a kind of a rhizome, a place of, this is my interpretation, a place of interaction, where there are all sorts of intensities can be shared that aren't concepts or doctrines. And it was a way in which, a body can intensively connect with other bodies of various portions in that community. It seemed quite very Deleuzian. And of course, when it was taken to the board, they said, no way, we are not doing this. And they said, there'll be none of that. And so it became very stratified, very territorialized, very cut off. And so you can just see, and this has nothing to do with truth or ideas or doctrine. This is just to do with how machines are managed. Yeah.
The rigid segmentarity.
Yes, that's right. So there are different kinds of machines. When someone said, I hate the idea of machines, Deleuze would say, he'd say, fine, it's a toolbox. Just put it back in the toolbox, get a different tool, get one that you think works better. So he's not stuck on these at all. If they don't work, get rid of them.
It's interesting because I do feel like you show the proliferation of machinic logic, if you will, throughout the book by working through a number of hugely important concepts from 1,000 Plateaus. I did appreciate, for example, in, if not the intro, then at least chapter 1, where you point out Guattari's contribution. I think that Guattari needs more love sometimes. And
there's no doubt about it. Yeah.
You brought out an aspect of the machine and structure essay that I think when Coop and I had discussed it, that I hadn't fully grasped very well, which was the fact that he's not only is he responding to, see, this just shows I didn't read their bio very, very thoroughly. I kind of skimmed it, but that he's responding to Deleuze's difference, repetition, and logic of sense, and showing where Deleuze doesn't quite get it right in the logic of sense. And I thought that was a nice moment. And it goes to show that, as you said, and then machines, sure, you could talk about desiring machines, and then that language might morph into assemblages or multiplicities or whatnot. It all depends on the kind of perspective or the problem at hand. I guess I'm thinking is what I liked about thinking about early Christianity, and you mentioned just a handful of the number of groups. We can even think about the different, even just historically, not all the way back to early Christianity, but the different schisms and the different heresies which populate the history of Christianity. Those all taking on, if we think of them as in a machinic way rather than merely in a structural way, I think there's something more dynamic at play. I know that sounds like a very banal thing to say, but perhaps it is, again, speaking as someone who's not an expert in this field, I think it helped me to think about the actual struggles going on and the local micro-political domains of the rise of Christianity, or the multiple origins, if you will.
And of course, that's the whole language of multiple origins is very apt. I think some of my students think that, so we have Jesus being, coming down onto earth, and then this is teaching, and then he hands it over to the 12, and then they go out, and of course that's not what happened. And so our early evidence shows we've got, Marcionites and who liked Paul, and forms of Jewish Christianity who despised Paul, and communities. We've got Gnostics. We've got the Hermetic tradition, which sort of pops up in the Gospel of John. We've got all sorts of things happening. And then there's this other group, which eventually becomes sort of the Orthodox, and then everybody else sort of gets locked up and put in jail.
Right.
If we can sort of forget about Constantine for a while and the historical emergence of Christendom, then we see its time of immense flux. And as you pointed out, there are also important connections with Greco-Roman religions as well, and there's a lot of work being done on that. And even though the concept of history is somewhat problematic, I am not a historical nihilist. I respect what those people do, and I think it can basically feed our intensities into our own mind and help us think differently. So I'm not down on that, though I'm not terribly keen on the endless inventions of historical Jesuses, which seems to have no end in sight. But I guess I would say that if somebody says, "Oh, I like Deleuze, but I still want to keep God," I think I could say that D&G give us a choice between following the familiar god of religion, which is the term he uses, kind of a father god who lives in a Platonic realm above, and what they term a schizo-god, transversal spirit that transgresses systems of faith and belief and transgresses systems of capture by opening up lines of flight. Needless to say, capitalism overcodes our desires and trains us to serve its needs, and likewise religion, and what Deleuze terms the god of religion, often overcodes our desires for some sort of bleak existence in a symbolic world. But going to your point, Taylor, every religious text, every creed, every catechism, every historical reconstruction of the first 4 centuries is a system of dispersion, full of microcracks, splits and fissures, like the San Andreas Fault running through Southern California. And if you run enough energy through these things, they split apart, they come undone. And so maybe that's a god that we can warm up to, this schizo-god. So Deleuze is not, it's one thing, he once said that theology is the science of non-existing entities, which sounds like possibly a critique of religion, but it's much more complicated than that, because all Deleuze-Guattarian theory is the science of non-existing entities.
Right. I was about to say events don't exist, they subsist or insist, right? So
exactly.
It's a provocative statement, though, right? Because you might hear that and think that he's talking trash, but he's actually maybe a little deeper. Yeah.
Yeah. And he even says that figures like Job and Abraham have the power to overcome the gap between secularism and religion. I'm not in any way trying to baptize Deleuze, but his program, or the ethics of schizoanalysis are really more about change and transformation of all kinds of structures, from the largest structures to the individual and even the sub-individual, and how that can happen, how we can be set in motion.
I have so much to respond to from what you had said, so I guess I'll try to grasp on a few. I'll say one remark, and then I'll respond more broadly. One was, in 1,000 Plateaus, but also I believe, I can't remember its negotiations but Deleuze's, or in the Abecedere in the interview when with Claire Parnay, when Deleuze is thinking about a differentiation between history, which tends towards a majoritarian mode and tends to try to make a structural determination that can have the last word, versus becomings. And so, from the standpoint of history, becomings are as though they were never in flux. Now, of course, that's a broad thing to say, and that might disparage certain historians who have done great work in this area, including history with a capital H, let's say. We could say similar things about philosophy with a capital P and the way that it does certain things. But I was going to, I think that the broader point to respond to is, and you have a chapter on this, on the god of religion, the schizo-god, and 2 names came to mind, one of whom you do bring up and have a chapter more or less on, where Deleuze's schizo-god does seem to be close to the god of Spinoza, if you will, with Deleuze's modifications, making the substance turn around the modes, whatnot, which is its own question. But the other thing that, and Coop and I were talking about before the show, in anti-oedipus, if there were a schizo-god, it would be the god of Schreber, for example, right? Which is how anti-oedipus begins. And I did want to give you a chance. I think, Coop, didn't you say in a footnote, Bradley mentioned Schreber, or am I?
No, I did, yeah.
Okay, yeah. And I guess I just wanted to think about the fact that even if later in the memoirs, the Schreber's god can be like broken down into a higher god and a lower god, and then we get some sort of almost Neoplatonist type vision, but it's also racialized, as we know, and there's sections on that in anti-oedipus. But I did wonder about this almost reenactment where Schreber almost, in his delirium, reimagines himself as a kind of Christ figure, but a becoming woman of Christ, right? Because he's got to give birth to a new humanity. And I didn't know if you had anything else you might want to say in relation to to Schreber and this notion of a schizo-god?
Of course, the notion of the body without organs is, I think, key here, inspired by Antonin Artaud. And I wrote a whole chapter on the a body of Christ as a body without organs. It's interesting the way Deleuze incorporates in various ways Freud's work theories, also Klein and even Lacan, maybe in a less obvious way. And again, I think he's part of this. We haven't really talked about mapping, but Deleuze is, as you know, some people say this is just crazy talk.
That wouldn't stop Deleuze and Guattari, right? Because that means a totally different thing for them. But anyway, go ahead.
So I think it's maybe useful to just remember that if we go right back to Deleuze, to difference and repetition, we can get a very good sense of what their method is, which actually carries through all of their writings, even though they're using different terms. And it begins as something called transcendental empiricism, where they want to escape Kant's representational use of concepts and the prejudices and ideologies that they produce. So they developed conceptual operations, not just concepts, but conceptual operations like the body without organs to destratify organisms, both human and institutional, by inducing what they later term a schiz, a mutation in life. They seek to intensify us. They want to change the way we think, the way we act, the way we live. And so they're not selling faith and popcorn. They're not telling us that we can become the people we really want to be. They're not telling us that the world is full of unicorns waiting to be discovered. This is very serious thought, because schizoanalysis is dangerous because it's tied to the death drive, which they talk about a lot in Proustian Signs. And this death drive can take us in very different directions, and they can take us into the death zone. And so in some ways, there's something very cautious about D&G, maybe less cautious than anti-oedipus and more cautious. But if you read Difference and Repetition, for example, it does not come across as some sort of 1960s drug-induced trip. So if we set it up what they're doing in terms of Kant's transcendental idealism, trying to escape the idealism of the supremacy of the mind, and asserting the importance of empiricism, but also saying that empiricism is directly connected to the conditions of possibility of existence and of textuality, then we're into a wonderful reciprocity where existence changes transcendentals and transcendentals change existence. Mm-hmm. And I think this gets to the very heart of what they're trying to do. I think it's clear now at the end of the period of the Enlightenment that the old methods of analysis, rooted in the history of ideas and unacknowledged transcendentals, Foucault would say this, for example, are dead ends. They don't take us anywhere. Our world is kind of a mess because of that. They do not create a schiz or line of flight. Nothing happens. And so D&G are concerned about the affirmation of cosmic desire, of the forces of life, which is interesting. If we look at Henri Bergson, who talks about these forces of life, he calls them élan vital. He also calls them the ruach, the spirit, the Jewish ruach. And so there's a really lovely kind of course, Bergson was culturally Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so they often say that D&G are philosophers of desire. Well, they are, but not in a Lacanian sense. And they could sort of think that we can sort of like stick our finger into an electrical outlet and receive a charge, and it kind of rewires us. It takes us out of the basis of attraction of our habitual attitudes. And they're not sort of stuck on denying old formulations or adopting gimmicky terms at all.
I think this is a good point, and it's definitely good that you work through that the body without organs is not, at least what it becomes in 1,000 Plateaus, is not merely opposed to the organism, but also opposed to the signifier and what you said earlier, opposed to the subject, at least in its molar form, right? And you have that. I love the line. I forget which chapter, but it was the epigram you start off with, or the lead and the epigraph. is it Luke 17:33, where those who want to keep their molar life will lose it, and those who want to lose their molar life will keep it? Or yeah, but you put molar in parentheses, obviously. So is this a practice you've done in your other books? I didn't necessarily notice it, but you took a lot of these quotes from the Bible, and one of the first that I brought up earlier, where you rework, I don't know if it's translated as bodies of Christ or churches of Christ as Christ machines, but you took a literary liberty.
Yeah.
Was this something, again, a part of experimentation in this book? Or?
Yeah, I had, of course, with Deleuze, style is important. It's part of the power of writing. It was a challenge to write the book because people in New Testament studies generally have little or no philosophical background. And so I didn't see it as an option to write a long introduction to what this concept means, whether it be immanence or a multiplicity or an assemblage or what have you, and then say, and now I'm going to apply this concept to this text.
So it was a hook. You were hooking you were trying to hook them?
I think you have to have a certain shock value that you're going to get right. I think it was on desire when I'm talking about Lacan and desire. I start with angels in heaven having sex with women on earth. And that takes me to Lacan's notion of desire quite well. And then I distinguish Deleuze's concept of desire as kind of a transcendental, desiring production. And so you're on this journey and you sort of say, what? I didn't know angels had sex with women and produced all these giants who ate all their food. I didn't know that. Boy, the Bible's interesting. And when I was dealing with Freud as well, and how his love of domesticated pets, and how Deleuze says, they're all, molar beings. We need wolves, right?
Right.
And Deleuze had to have, he said there was a wolf, but he said there's a pack of wolves, and he missed it so he's sort of picking these funny fights with Lacan and Hegel, I would say, and Kant and even Nietzsche. It's very playful. And I think Thousand Plateau is a very fun book. Obviously, it had very deep roots, and I think the rhizome, for example, can be easily totally misunderstood. But I think that's, if you're going to try to, engage people in biblical studies, you have to keep it fairly light and always be trying to draw connections of some sort. And if you can make it a little funny, Deleuze likes humor and irony are key principles for Deleuze as ways of breaking up systems. That's a segue for the Gospel of Mark, for example, and for many other things. He finds the story of Abraham extremely funny. I'm reminded that we may find Kafka's stories very dark and serious, but when he read them out to his friends, like the trial, they were all rolling on the ground laughing. And so I think there's room for a lot more awareness of humor in these systems and its ability to induce schizzes into our modes of thought.
That's a good point. So that puts into context very well that you did have a certain audience in mind. You were trying to lead with material they'd be familiar with, but then you also deterritorialized it a little bit. You defamiliarized certain things that they would perhaps be familiar with, and maybe for a little shock value, for a little humor, for, again, denaturing what they might already have, lines they would have already read hundreds of times. And so it does bring a shock to thought, right? It does force one to sort of encounter something anew. There was another line just off the top of my head that I'm remembering where you were talking about becoming woman. I know it's a short chapter, but you have this formulation where you say man, quote unquote, can be saved, only by becoming woman. I thought the formulation was interesting only because obviously you mean it in the molecular sense, you mean it in the sense of Deleuze and Guattari say it. If you put it into context of Bible studies, when you were talking about man, it's only through Christ or something like this can he be saved. It was a nice little form. And I'm only paraphrasing. I'm not even doing
No, that's fine. I even say the Virgin Mary has to become woman.
Yeah, there you go. That formulation stood out to me. But you brought up Mark, and there was a couple concepts, obviously, we want to hit along the way that I think deserve mention. I think one of them we can spend a lot of time on, which would be the scapegoat, and that'll circle back around to some of your earlier work. But you mentioned Mark, and I did want to give you a chance because you said that it sounds like you are already writing about maybe something new. I'm sure you've written about Mark before in the past. I just meant that because of your interests. But is there a reason for perhaps why Mark should be centered front and center for a Deleuzian approach? Is there something perhaps less transcendent than these other versions that we get? You mentioned the like the Hermetic tradition in John, or Luke's kind of drawing from this prophetic type passional Jesus as you work out. We could say the many Jesuses. I'm sorry, but we're trying to think about the characterization.
Oh, sure. No,
what is it about Mark's Jesus for you? And Deleuze, I guess, or not.
Yeah. As I said, every early Christian text is a system of dispersion, but Mark is just a wonderful example of that, because there are so many ways in which the story gets interrupted. The style is what they call very paratactic. It's sort of just these little stories that get sort of added on to one another, and this, and this, and this, and this, which is there are, of course, a lot of parables, and parables by their very nature do not signify any. They do not point in a direct way to something else. They can mean anything, right? As opposed to, anyway, it's gone out of my head. But so there's the paratactic, the parabolic, and also the paradoxical. I mean, it seems, if you think of what happens from chapter 8 to chapter 16, what dominates that? Well, the Son of Man going to Jerusalem for his passion, right? Well, that's verse 1:1 says that he's the Christ and the Son of God. It says nothing about the Son of Man. And suddenly the Son of Man is the most important thing, and he emphasizes it through 3 passion narratives. Well, the big part of the Son of Man tradition, maybe the primary part, is eschatology. Daniel 7. So we sort of think that, oh, wow, this is there's going to be the passion, and then there's going to be this heavenly this heavenly intervention and angels and trumpets. What happens at the end of chapter 15? Nothing. Jesus calls out to God, says, why did this happen to me? God, who's not very chatty in the Gospel of Mark at the best of times, you hear about the baptism and transfiguration. He doesn't say anything. And then Jesus just dies. The centurion says, surely this was the son of a god. So he doesn't really know what's going on. Nobody pays attention, and nothing happens. You could say it's a very dark, funny ending, Scandinavian dark maybe, that nothing happens. And then it seems that the young man who running around naked at the time of Jesus' arrest ends up at the tomb for some reason and tells the women that Jesus isn't there. And then, and Jesus, of course, doesn't say at the end when he dies, it is finished. That's right. Luke. He doesn't have it'd be easy for him to say something that would have said, good, job well done. There's nothing. There's nothing. And then the women are terrified and they run away. And they say nothing to nobody. That's in the original ending of the Gospel of Mark in 16:8. So there's a lot of irony and humor. There's a lot of discontinuity. There's a lot of expectations that are never fulfilled. And really nothing connects with anything else. The story of the Last Supper doesn't connect easily to the Passion predictions. They don't connect easily to Mark 10:34-35, where Jesus says that he has to become a slave. What does a slave have to do with the apocalyptic Son of Man? You can sort of see that the scholars are often convinced that even though it doesn't seem to make sense, it's got to make sense, and that we're the problem. What about saying, no, we're not the problem? It's a discontinuous system. And then this takes us into maybe much more interesting questions. So Deleuze, if he was looking at this, say in the way he does in Logic of Sense, he would map out maybe 34 different series, and he would superimpose them, and in which, of course, this is a series of discontinuity as well, without an author, by the way. So anyway, that's just a good example that the Gospel of Mark is extremely disquieting, very troubling, which is why Matthew and Luke felt they had to rewrite it so fulsomely.
Sort of overcode it a little bit, right? Try to put the literary machines into order.
Yeah. We need some genealogies here and get rid of some of this filler and need to But still, these traditions tend to be conservative. But of course, Jesus never claims to be the Son of God, never claims to be the Christ, and he only refers to himself as the Son of Man or the Son of Humanity indirectly. But it does seem this term, which isn't introduced in the first 8 chapters, seems to become a pivotal term. But what's it got to do with the suffering? Passion predictions say it's written in Scripture. Well, where? Nowhere. So it's perplexing, but I think rich for Deleuzian analysis.
This just makes me think, I'm wondering if this is part of your investigations in the curse Christ and Paul and what Paul is trying to do, and sort of give an overarching narrative for example, these predictions of suffering would lead one to believe that it's almost predicting Jesus being that one side being scapegoat, right? Or is that a reach? Maybe I'm reaching a little bit. I didn't quite connect it, but
yeah. So the scapegoat again is a concept of Christ as scapegoat in Deleuze, which is kind of a diagrammatic force that cuts across systems or structures, such as the regime of signs, for example, and even also the prophecy regime, and then sort of renders a rupture in it, allowing it to morph into something else. And so it's an anti-structuralist force. So in terms of, one could liken it to the concept of repetition and difference in repetition. And so that's useful to talk about that in terms of the Christian texts. We could find other examples of that in other texts and in literature and art and so forth. But so the scapegoat principle isn't, it's a handy concept for looking at early Christian narrative, for example, and Pauline theology, but it could be applied almost anywhere.
I did like that your reading of when you sort of give the opposed reading of the despotic Christ versus the passional, the prophetic Christ. You're playing John off against Luke, so to speak. At least that's the
Q via Luke. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
And that's right, because you do. I did see that. I think it is in the intro. The Curse Christ, where you say there is this larger body of, what is it? The sayings Q, something like this, or
yeah. So I'm sure you don't want to talk about Q now, but I'm just saying that I'm not. Again, these kinds of analyses of Mark and Luke and John are not. They're not theological. I'm not saying they're theologically true or historically true, but I'm saying that basically that the history of the idea of history and theology of this early period is extremely problematic, and is inevitably used in order to stratify and territorialize Christianity in the present. Remember, there's a quote by Charles Péguy in the early 20th century, and of course, Deleuze talks about Péguy, and he says that we can't do a history of like the early Greco-Roman times because we don't have enough data. We can't do a history of our own time because we have too much data. So we can only do history that in some in-between period. I guess that's the sweet spot of the Middle Ages or something. But having too much information, I mean, how many books do we have about John F. Kennedy and Churchill and what have you? So we have way too much information. How much information do we have about the historical Jesus? Virtually none, which is why we can create so many new Jesuses as needed. History and a lot of typical denominational theology are highly suspect, and this comes under the rubric of history being written by the winners, of the battles. So, like, that's just a tiresome cliche. But again, Deleuze is not trying to get it right. He's not putting forward the right version of things. He's not really interested in history, but he does make, curiously, a lot of use of Christian and Jewish texts and theology. And much of this post-structural tradition, whether we look at Foucault, Derrida, or even Guattari or others, it is almost couldn't exist without the Christian tradition. You can't deconstruct nothing. Deleuze fits into a much bigger intellectual panorama, and as does Guattari. And they're really in conversation with a lot of contemporaries, like Roland Barthes and obviously Marcel Proust, and you've mentioned Spinoza and Bergson and many, many others. These are not just kind of men who had these visions at night, about bodies of organs and Schreber's, asshole and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's a finely nuanced debate. And I think the repetition of it, the constant, like with every new book, it's a total new take on it, is really an embodiment of their philosophy of repetition. They're not on a Hegelian quest towards perfection. It's not Hegelian. There's no direction. There's just sort of a past, present, a present, and a future present,
I brought up Spinoza in reference to the Skitso-god because in What is Philosophy, I assume it's Deleuze saying this, but it's Deleuze and Guattari supposedly said, Spinoza is the Christ of philosophers. And it's because he never compromised with transcendence. He didn't make, and you obviously write about the plane of eminence and reference What is Philosophy. And I'm not sure if in the footnote you may have mentioned this phrase, right, that about Deleuze calling Spinoza the Christ of philosophers, but it was just something that I wrote down in my notes, just thinking about, I wonder what Bradley would have to say about this claim. And first of all, whether or not that is itself meant to be humorous is up for debate. But if we took it maybe seriously instead of literally, I feel like that's a kind of interesting remark.
Yeah.
Itself.
Maybe a couple of things. One is that when Deleuze deals with Spinoza in his later writings, he's talking a lot about affect, but it's affect understood in a way of bodies acting upon bodies. And the power of action it fills one with joy, and the power of being acted upon fills one with sadness. And so these are bodies acting upon bodies. So this is very much a world of three-dimensional things. In Deleuze's earlier writings, affect is like a microparticle, like a percept. They are the building blocks of emotions and the building blocks of perceptions. And it's a world in which there are no subjects and objects, but only multiplicities, where the rhizome, everything's connected to everything else. So I think in Thousand Plateaus, the virtual plane and the molecular plane and the molar plane are sometimes difficult to distinguish between them. I mean, they are sort of two sides of the same Mobius strip. Like another person who's a great hero of Deleuze is Kierkegaard. And he never wrote a book, of course, on Kierkegaard. But Kierkegaard, I've been writing on this, appears all over the place. And Deleuze has a great respect for Kierkegaard as well as, of course, Nietzsche and others. And even though he seems to despise Hegel and difference in repetition, later on he sort of says, oh, well, Hegel was a genius. I think Deleuze is always kind of pulling her leg a bit. And sometimes he seems to treat Freud cruelly. And then other times he's heavily reliant on him, as he is in the second edition of Proust and Signs. And there are close connections between Deleuze and Lacan as well. And I think Deleuze's three passive syntheses can be kind of mapped onto Deleuze's three symbolic and imaginative and the other one.
The RSI, the real.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think maybe this is a form of scholarly debate that we are not really accustomed to in this side of the Atlantic. I've been reading Roland Barthes recently, and Barthes has very kind things to say about Deleuze and so forth. So he's not the bad guy structuralist either. So anyway, I don't know where I'm going with this, but obviously Deleuze has a passion for Spinoza, which I think helped prepared him to write one of his last books on Francis Bacon, Sense and Sensation, which is another masterful work, not written with Guattari. But I think they are all he's kind of in conversation with everybody in terms of literature, Proust, art, Bacon, and then others. But he did once just graphically describe his relationship with other philosophers as a form of buggery.
Yes.
So we shouldn't lose track of that as well.
He said it's buggery or immaculate conception to bring Jesus back in. That's, in negotiations where that part's usually left out. It's usually the buggery and that's how I normally. But I did reread that section a few weeks ago. Yeah. So he also thinks of it as immaculate conception, and so already he's putting himself in Christ's shoes or in God's shoes, if you will.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Anyway, maybe this is not very edifying for your viewers, but
no. I mean, we're talking through these things. I mean, I was thinking about Kierkegaard. One of the things, he puts Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in the Introduction to Difference Repetition, and thinks of them as developing a philosophy of the future. And I think, is it in Thousand Plateaus, or maybe it's Anti-Oedipus, when he brings up Kierkegaard and just a gentleman in his Sunday's best being that's right. Indistinguishable from a revolutionary, I think is kind of how he puts it. Right. So
he returns to him in What is Philosophy, of course, written with Guattari, and he also returns to Abraham there. So Kierkegaard is a character who haunts Deleuze's philosophy in a way that's less, like Foucault, I would say as well. Foucault sort of haunts Deleuze, and there are important points, like there are profound points of connection between discourse on language in Foucault and Deleuze's his logic of sense, for example. And Foucault wrote a whole review, for example, of that, and also his archaeology of knowledge. We don't need to necessarily literalize these concepts, but they do help us think in ways which we would otherwise be unable to think because of the way our academic training has stratified and territorialized our processes. I think that very, very strongly, and Deleuze does intensify our scholarship and also makes us be able to see multiple perspectives simultaneously.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I know that one of them that you lead with in the introduction to this book is arguing against a method of genealogy, again, as though one could unearth, whether it be one could unearth the true origin of Christianity, and as you said, that would be Christ or some such, or even like I'm trying to think, you would have to have something similar to a geology, in the sense in which, for example, Freud thinks about the unconscious. Like if Rome, you could go back to the first hills where everything and have that coexist alongside everything else, then you might see something like a geological picture of what he, at his best, thinks of the unconscious. Obviously, at his worst, he Oedipalizes it and restricts it and cuts it off.
We haven't talked about the unconscious, of course, but just on the point of, I mean, obviously there's something geological about 1,000 Plateaus. He talks about sedimentation and different kinds. Brian Masumi talks about this at length, and about territories.
Stratification.
But it's interesting that strata is also a primary Freudian term.
Yes.
Right? And so it's psychoanalytic. And the word plateau, which we think of geographically, is also the same word for a stage, for theater. And of course, Deleuze has a lot to say about theater and masks and settings and characters. And even the word series means stage set. So these French terms have lots of resonances that sometimes I think we're not entirely aware of.
Conceptual personae, right?
Yes, perceptual personae and aesthetic personae. Very good.
So,
and all these things are worthy of discussion. In I think the last chapter of my book, I also talk about the nomadology and the war machine. And there, I you may recall, I sort of begin by doing kind of going like whole hog historicist, Jesus as a political revolutionary, and then I, of course, pull back on that and say, this is just inspires us to talk about nomadology and the war machine, which some people believe is the most difficult of all of Deleuze's concepts, and I think that may be true. I'd like to do more on nomadology, but of course it's also in the war machine. But I think one way of thinking about some aspects of early Christianity is in terms of the war machine.
No, this is interesting because, they first, one of the mentions of nomadism, and they don't say war machine, right? But in anti-oedipus, I think it's the end of chapter 2 where they are discussing these sort of nomadic Christian bands, and that you have to sort of you have to look at these in order to understand in order to understand early Christianity. And of course, that leads into obviously the medieval ages and the setting up of various monasteries and all of these other formations, depending on, whichever historical setting we look at, but that's, I guess that the war machine, you're right. I think that one of the reasons why it may be so misleading is because it doesn't take war as its object, right? And it's only by being appropriated by the state apparatus that it is deployed solely for the object of war. You brought up Abraham earlier, but she didn't bring up Moses. And one of the things that I liked about the regimes of signs, and you do write about Moses in your book, was I was trying to think about certain ways in which Moses, for me, helps me to understand certain concepts in A Thousand Plateaus, like, for example, the numbering number, and how Moses kind of learns this art of numbering from what his father-in-law, I think Deleuze and Guattari say that right out, but also I think very well Moses is deployed to help understand one of the aspects of the scapegoat, which is the double turning away in the post-signifying regime, right? Turning away from the god of Amun-Ra, the Egyptian despotic signifier, towards this faceless god. And I thought that your exposition of some of that was very helpful to put into context. And I think I mentioned before the show, I also thought it was interesting to juxtapose this, as you say, in the beginning was the word, blah, 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 where Jesus is the sort of face of God versus this prophetic Jesus in Luke that is more the faceless scapegoat. So these juxtapositions of faciality, of the double turning away, and it helped me to understand the scapegoat a little bit better in not only Deleuze and Guattari, but in the Gospels.
When I teach the introduction to the New Testament, when I get to the Gospel of John and I tell everyone that Jesus is the face of God, suddenly everyone's relaxed and they say, finally,
we're at home.
Finally, it's okay. It's okay. So it's interesting that the power of saying that. I don't talk about regimes, right? But suddenly the temperature goes down and, everything's going to be all right.
That would be the perfect time to say, okay, now we're going to turn to Deleuze and Guattari. Just to unsettle you again. We can't have you be too relaxed.
But no, I think the concept of faciality works very well in the Gospel of John. It's almost begging to be interpreted that way, as the Gospel of Luke with its Q document sort of speaking through it, that the prophecy seems to be very, very, very strong. And then you mentioned Moses, which maybe takes us to the Gospel of Matthew. But it's also interesting that Moses was known in antiquity as the magician. There's about 7 Greek magical papyri, magical books, all dedicated to Moses, because of course in Egypt he was quite the magician, right? He could do all the things he did.
Or the sorcerer, if we think about becoming Xanimal. Right?
Sorcerer, And again, when I talk to students about the 3 wise men being sorcerers, which is the term in the Greek text, they get, no, this can't possibly be. This is just this is crazy town. But no, they are, and I point out that if you look at Jesus in many of his synoptic miracles, but also Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus is a young boy at the age of 6 and doing all these miracles. I mean, Jesus was a great magician, a great sorcerer, and we see that not only in his some of his miracles where he uses saliva and mud and so forth, but also maybe with the Gerasene demoniac and casting out the swine. I think, of course, Deleuze was very interested in magic, and I'm writing now a piece on exotic concepts in the Greek magical papyri and in connection with Bergson and the Elan Vital. But I think it gives us an interesting place to go to. Moses can be kind of dangerous territory because we don't want to sort of turn him in this kind of stratifying character. We don't want this tradition to end an anti-Judaism kind of form of scholarship where I'm saying something negative about Moses, like from a Pauline point of view. So I think maybe possibly D&G go over the line a little bit. But I do have some sensitivities about just going.
Would you like to share, or
well,
maybe if you want, we could talk after the show and cut this. But if you feel like there's a critique there, I'm all ears.
Yeah, well, and of course, I'm quite aware of the history in Europe of the Jews over the last pick it 500 years, pick any number of years you want, and so I find I have to be a bit self-censoring, but I think from a Deleuzean point of view, Moses can be quite a powerful figure. Because we don't want to look at it from a Pauline way, which is, of course, profoundly negative.
We're overturning. We're here to overturn the Mosaic Law, right?
It has been abrogated,
right?
And it's nothing, and it was just handed down by angels, and so it's imperfect, and it just leads to slavery, death. And of course, the whole concept of law is important in D&G as well as Lacan, Freud, and so forth. And so I sometimes I think it's important to be aware of the bigger picture and not just sort of apply these concepts, willy-nilly. And
that is a good point, because law is so central to Paul's arguments in his epistle.
Yeah, right. But maybe going back to the history of early Christianity, my thought is that even though Paul was obviously wrote a lot of letters, and those letters became important in the maybe mid-2nd century and later. My hunch is that he had almost no impact whatsoever on early Christianity. I'm not sure anybody would have really known who he was. Of course, he really wasn't a Christian at all. He was Jewish, and so he's obviously important for the theological tradition. But I'd say relatively unimportant, except to the degree that certain groups rallied around him or rallied against him. Early Christianity was extremely fragmented, and as you pointed out, its origins really connect with almost everything. Some people attribute Paul invented Christianity, which maybe, it seems that there is virtually no connection between Jesus as we encounter him in the Synoptic Gospels and Paul's writings.
He created a version of it, or tried to stratify it and organize it that might build up to the rudiments of maybe the Catholic or Orthodox Church, right?
Yeah, well, he tells us that Jesus was born of a woman. We'll have to write that down. That's interesting. Paul seems to know nothing about the synoptic tradition. Certainly, no empty tomb. No miracles.
But apparently, he had his own vision of Christ, right? Doesn't he write himself in and try to give himself some authority?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So we have the one very brief mention of that in Galatians, which seems. There's a preposition which is confusing, preposition "n." It was Christ revealed to him or in him, but he tells us almost nothing. The 3 accounts in the book of Acts are all inventions of the author. There is a reference to that in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is he calls himself as an abortion, as one untimely born, was the last to have this vision. But the point of that is to confirm his own authority as an apostle. Anyway, whatever one makes of all of this, Paul, it seems, did consider himself an apostle, and I think many others did, but he wasn't, like, his traveling to Rome isn't sort of a vehicle by way the whole Mediterranean was, the Christianity spread everywhere at all. Whatever the truth of early Christian history is, it's the truth of the rhizome. Yeah. It really is.
I was just thinking about discussion of the need for giving himself authority, but also this distinction between, is it Peter and the 12? Is it James? And this whole question of whom Jesus appears to after death. And then it turns into this question about the need for substantiating the resurrection of the body, which gets us back to affect, which you brought up earlier. And Paul is concerned with disputing those who might think that now we're sort of, now that Jesus is risen, we are sort of immortal. But no, there is a rising of the body, and there is a lifting up to the clouds, if you will, as the last horn sounds. And I thought that discussion of bodies was interesting, and it does make its way, at least some of the lines make its way into this present book. This question of what is it? What can a Christ body do? I think that was the chapter, and why is Paul, talking about these literal bodies being lifted up into the heavens? But he means it. I think he, as you pointed out, he seems to be trying to convince whomever he's writing to that he means it literally, and not in some different way that might misconstrue what the resurrection implies.
It sounds like you're thinking of like the Thessalonian correspondence and the apocalyptic return, and also in chapter 15 as well, and in other places, obviously. Paul was clearly an apocalypticist who drank deeply from the well of Jewish apocalypticism, and is speaking a language which was familiar to many people, and had a very much, at least in his earlier letters, a sense of the approach of the end times. And of course, he tells people in 1 Corinthians 7, don't get married because there's no point, because the end is coming, and it's just going to be more complicated, and just generally life is more complicated if you're married.
But also don't worry about those who have died before Jesus' return. I thought that was an interesting
so they're not going to be left disadvantaged, right? Yeah. In fact, they're going to be raised first up into the clouds. And there's an American country and western song that's all about flying around in the clouds. I don't know if you've heard that. Anyway, so so it's difficult when you're teaching the New Testament not to get sort of caught up in all these arcane worldviews that are this mythical worldview, which doesn't really pertain anymore. But then people are saying these texts are authoritative. Perhaps Deleuze and Guattari have a role here to help us reconfigure our approach to these texts. If we look at the logic of sense, for example, it is explicitly about propositions, and you could say discourse in kind of a Foucauldian way, but also more generally about narrative and literature. I think it can be approached quite easily to early Christian writings, especially the canonical Gospels, and maybe release us from the old kinds of questions we ask and move into something new. Certainly, I think. If you talk about it's not problematic at all to talk about a Christian group, Pauline group, as the body of Christ. Paul does that. So, and if you say, oh no, it's the body without organs of Christ, nothing much changes. It really works. And for some people, it might be exactly transferable. And then you're into a whole new conversation, because as I wrote in one of the chapters, that this body without organs is extremely dynamic, and all sorts of things can happen. And so I think these conceptual operations that Deleuze provides to us do unlock a lot of fecund insights. But they may not be, seem in the first appearance as theological.
I think it's important that something like that formulation, again, which we, mentioned, it's not just meant to shock or meant to be humorous, but there is something to it where it would be, if we consider their notion of the rhizome multiplicity, which is always in N-1 dimensions, we are subtracting any sort of hierarchical organizational term from the equation, thereby the power of the church with a capital C to sort of organize and lay down the law, if you will, and to provide a sort of order externally outside of the dynamic relations that we're discussing. If that's the body of Christ. That's how I see Paul trying to, he's like the great organizer. I'm not sure if, he like founded Christianity. I mean, obviously you were throwing some shade at perhaps an overblown conception of his importance. And that's important to also know his lack of importance, perhaps for the early Christians. That just furthers your argument that, it's only from the outside that there is this sort of attempt to sort of recontain the dynamicity. And then I think that that's also where we see the history of Christianity going beyond the scope of early Christianity with all discussion of heresies and like what.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I brought up the Pauline question where he's writing against what might be these incipient, inchoate heresies in the making.
We could talk about how we can reconfigure early Christianity if that's helpful, but it might be useful to point out that Deleuze doesn't require an act of faith from us. Right. He doesn't want us to convert to the worship of the rhizome, First and foremost, Deleuze is an empiricist. And like the Greek Stoics, he's committed to experimenting with the conditions of experience. And some of his starting points, like univocity, I believe coheres with our experience. There's no super temporal realm where a God of Platonic essences, exists. The rhizomic nature of life coheres with our experience that everything is dynamically connected. I think almost everybody knows this intuitively. His intuition that existence is profoundly temporal. That, I think, coheres with our experience that everything is in flux all the time. Our bodies are in flux. And as we age, they are more in flux, unfortunately. And the virtuality of life coheres with our experience of becoming, not just of ourselves, but really everything around us. If Deleuze, as I said, is not just making things up. He's got these conceptual operations, these terms he invents with an idea to experimentally encounter life and but really to see how we feel. That brings us back to affect, or see how we perceive differently without the mind, without the synthetic faculties, without the idea of the spirit, or of the soul, which Kant would say. He wants to stay as far away from the Kantian problem as possible. So you mentioned empiricism, I think, and affect. They're very close to the center of the Deleuzian project because it's connected with empiricism. And so when we look at, say, early Christianity, this insight about empiricism draws us away from debating about who was more important or what happened, but really about what does matter in the present for us now. Does it overcode our world more? Does it induce a schiz in our world? Can we live life differently, or is it just another matter of overcoding? And I think a lot of historical construction entails overcoding, or sometimes deterritorializations for the sake of reterritorializations. So you could see with a lot of pure historicists are deterritorialized from a kind of a storybook version of early Christianity, but then they become reterritorialized in a hardcore historicist mode, like von Ranke, what actually happened mode. And that is, in my experience, even more killing. I don't think anything can kill one's spirit more than hardcore historicism. It doesn't take us anywhere. And this is why it's so unpopular. Theologians hate it, students hate it, but people obviously in New Testament studies think it's the bread and potatoes of the discipline.
I suppose I have been trying to get you to go back into historicism, but perhaps to try to connect in your trajectory from what might have been the bread and butter of the discipline and your means of trying to find lines of flight out into other avenues for exploring some of the same literary machines and these social machines that you are obviously deeply interested in and have spent your life studying. So it does feel like that at least is, I think that in and of itself is testament to what Deleuze brings to the table. Obviously, specifically, 1,000 Plateaus. I was thinking of the line when they're discovering, or they're discussing Gabriel Tarde in relation to Emile Durkheim, and they're saying, for Tarde, every flow is a flow of belief and desire because it's quantifiable. It's at the root of every society, and I think that that's one of the ways that I could already see that plugged into the early chapters of your book and leading into the rest of it is these flows of belief and desire at the heart of these different machines trying to engineer in various ways their own fidelity to the Christ event.
And we could just introduce at this point the concept of smooth space and segmented space or rigid space.
Street space. Street space. Yeah.
And sort of, not that one's good and one's bad, but you're always sort of negotiating the battle line between those things. And that's in some ways kind of an easy analytic if you were looking at Christian groups or other groups today. I mean, if you want to understand nomadics, just look at Al-Qaeda, or ISIS, you can see it live. So I'm not sure where we go from there. But are you saying you would like me to push me into kind of historical engagement again? Because I can do that.
No. I was apologizing that many of my questions were maybe from a historicist point of view, but I am glad that you were able to counterpose what you were doing when you were thinking Deleuze in relation to this material that you're very passionate about. And I suppose I'm only a neophyte in this area, and I found so much of the discussion of, I don't want to say a spin, but you made me look at the New Testament, for example, in completely new ways from a vantage point that I may feel familiar with, i.e. the Deleuzian one. So I think that that's why I was trying to dig deeper into these things that I'm only familiar with from your writing. It's hopefully you weren't feeling I was trying to get you to play.
No, not at all. I was, but I could do that if you wanted.
No. It's just, I guess that it's interesting to think about. I had also forgotten how much of the history of Christianity shows up throughout, even just 1,000 Plateaus, not even like branching out into the other books that we were discussing.
I don't think there's been enough written about it. It's still early days. And so it's clearly a preoccupation with the Deleuze and Guattari. But what I was going to say, maybe just coming back to the beginning, what captivates me about D and G is that they're trying to find a way to achieve the impossible, to do what everyone says is impossible. Kant says, all we can know are phenomena. All we can know is this world which is constructed by our minds. That seems like it might be true, a frightening truth. Jacques Lacan says, once you pass into the symbolic, there is no way out. Just live with it. You go to therapy to live with it and understand it better. Yeah. And I wrote one of my chapters on Eve and Thecla and how they found a way out. And so, maybe the long and the short of it is that D&G are wrong and there's no way out. There's no red pill. The red pill is just a blue pill that's been painted. But it's a tantalizing idea to see, is there a way of sort of shedding some of our territorialization, shedding all the ways in which we've been converted into an organism over the years? And this isn't just picking one pill is not going to do it, but is there a way of life, a way of engaging life, where some of this overcoding and territorialization can be broken apart and undone, and we can discover ways of living creatively and living with other people in healthy ways. And so I think this is like when you look at religion and how stratified and territorialized, packed with prejudice and ideology, maybe we've had too much of the God of religion, and if we invited the Skitso-god to church now and then, it wouldn't be a bad thing. I mean, I don't think in North America it's difficult to understand this because structuralism never crossed the Atlantic. So the idea that we're caught in structures and don't have any freedom is not a very North American idea. But right. Europeans get this. And the whole question about Abraham and Job revolves around this almost Sartrean question of freedom. Do we have it? Do we have freedom? And Deleuze has an answer for that. And so he's dealing with the darkness of the human condition, whether we think of it in Lacanian terms or Kantian terms. Even Hegel is kind of maybe not dark, but there's something very deterministic in Hegel, that it's all got to end one way, to tell us at the end. And so D&G are saying, no, there are choices we can make that are made available to us. These are non-potentiated possibilities for living, which pre-exist us, and we can embody or incarnate, but they're there. And all those unpotentiated possibilities, many of them, maybe most of them, never get potentiated, but we have at least the choice to choose amongst those provided to us by the virtual realm. This strikes me as a helpful way of thinking. In the Gospel of Mark, two of the things that run through it is, one is, this has got to happen. This has got to happen. We've got three prophecies. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. There's no way out, but it's God's plan. But somehow it relies on Judas. And he had to make a choice, right? And then Jesus, even though he gets angry at Peter saying, no, I got to do this, in the Garden of Gethsemane, seems he's got to make a choice. And so this ongoing debate about determinism and free will, sort of you can have kind of a way of thinking about it. And the notion of the virtual, or what Deleuze terms aeon in Logic of Sense, is a way of not just sort of arguing about time or temporality, but of sort of having a useful way of self-reflecting on how one lives one's own life. And so, presumably, if Christianity is about anything, it has a existential component of how we live and how we treat each other. And so I think this is a meaningful connection. It's not just about dogma and then going to happy land when we die.
I like that you came back around to a nice way of asserting why Deleuze is useful here, instead of, and I even think of it like when you brought up Sartre, I was thinking about how Deleuze might shift the emphasis on being condemned to be free to something much more about affirming even while we affirm our facticity, we are still able to counter actualize the event, or something like this. So I did like the affirmation in your message there. And I know we've had you for 2 hours, Bradley. I do want to give you a chance to maybe say a little bit more, or say anything you want about what you are working on. This is basically your platform, just to let us know what we can expect from you in the future.
Thanks. It's very kind of you. And so, as you know, the book you read focuses mostly on 1,000 Plateaus and anti-oedipus, the so-called schizoanalytic project. But what I'm focusing on now is really three books, or four, I guess, that were written in a very closely together. I could expand it, but Difference in Repetition. The first edition of Proust and Signs appeared before that. Then the year after, we've got The Logic of Sense. And then we got the 1970, the second edition of Proust and Signs. And then there's a third. And then we got Bergsonianism in there. And people might read them and saying, Deleuze is all over the map. This is like, I don't know what he's up to. He just, has he got ADHD or what's up with Deleuze? And what I would like to argue is that the same method is being carried out, which he calls in the book Empiricism and Subjectivity, and Transcendental Empiricism. And so we have it in more general terms with Difference in Repetition in the first volume. Then we have Bergsonianism saying more about multiplicities and memory. Then we have Logics of Sense and that beautiful treatment of sense and aeon and chronos. And then perhaps my favorite is the second edition of Proust and Signs, and where he sees textual interpretation as a form of symptomology, where the affects give off different kinds of symptoms, like emotions, and you can read those as the production of the three machines of time. And so nobody can describe what the transcendental is. Of course, it's always changing, but he's looking at the transcendental through this, what I'm calling sort of mapping and stacking of series. And then we're also able to close in from life to literature and propositions to narrative. He looks at Proust, but I can look at the Gospels. Mm-hmm. And then the subject is not the traditional subject of early Christianity, the grounded subject, but he says, no, he's an apprentice, which is a term that Proust uses and others talk about. And I think that's extremely liberating because it shows that this is a kind of an experimental process of trial and error and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And it recognizes the textual meaning comes from an overlapping of two multiplicities. So the text as a multiplicity and the interpreter as a multiplicity. And in when there are changes, of course, from book to book, but that's the whole point, right? Deleuze is saying, don't believe these words, don't believe these concepts. They inject movement into you, into me. And the point of doing this is, as I said, not to get a new set of facts, but to shed over coding, over stratifications, characterization, and to be injected with movement, which is something that Deleuze and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard all believe in. They go on at length at the beginning of Difference and Repetition about the importance of creating movement. Anyway, so that's my little commercial for what I hope to finish this coming year.
Excellent. That sounds like a nice swath to look at. As you said, you've looked at capitalism with schizophrenia. So now leading up to it and just around it, sort of, you can look at transcendental empiricism and perhaps how that informs all of these things. And so it sounds like it's almost a sequel or a prequel to the book that you've just written then.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'll write it in a more sensible, philosophical style, and rather than trying to explain every little thing to the newcomers. So I think it'll be a more serious book and maybe a book that has more of me in it. I'm currently reading through all of À la recherche du temps perdu of Marcel Proust and pulling out all of the Bergsonian influences and neo-Kantian influences. And so I'm trying to write a more literary book, which is really more geared to people who are sympathetic to the Deleuzian project rather than just sort of the curious.
I will suggest, because you like Proust and science so much, that second edition, the second half of the Machinic Unconscious is a really interesting reading of Proust. And I think Guattari shows himself to be he shows himself to be a pretty interesting reader. And it would have, now, but see, the problem would be it would have too much continuity with 1,000 Plateaus. So you would have to retread old water, and it would, I'm
kind of okay. But thanks for reminding me that, Proust shows up in Difference and Repetition, but he shows up much more in this. So thanks for reminding me about that.
And he does show up in 1,000 Plateaus as well, So, I mean, they were both obviously, French intellectuals. How are they not going to be influenced by Proust?
That's right. But thanks for reminding me about that. So I think there'll be a lot of Proust and Bergson in this book as well.
Well, that sounds wonderful. And hopefully we'll be able to see that in sometime next year. And, but Bradley, I do appreciate you spending this, not only this Sunday, but this Mother's Day with us and talking through some of the themes surrounding your work. And I just want to thank you again for spending time with us and being generous with your time. And I appreciated your scholarship.
Well, Cooper and Taylor, I really, really am grateful to you for taking my work so seriously and actually reading it and engaging it and thinking about it. And I'm grateful to you for giving me a time to talk about what gives me life, and that is D&G. Earnestly, thank you for this opportunity.
As Coop said, it'll probably be out in 3 weeks. So we'll be in touch before then. And definitely as soon as the episode comes out, I will tag you on Twitter so you'll at least see it there. If I don't speak to you before then, I do want to say thanks again. We are going to stay on just so we can plan for next week's episode as a debrief. Okay. But we will let you go and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Okay. Well, you're doing great work, guys. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks again. Thank you, Bradley. Once again, thanks to Bradley McClean for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.